Good afternoon. This is Rebecca Smith-Aldridge. I'm the coordinator for library sustainability for the MidHudson Library System, and we want to thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about drafting a very basic facility plan to help your library stay on top of some basic issues, as well as start to project your goals for the future with your facility. Just a little bit of a background for myself. I've been at MidHudson for about 18 years, and part of my work is administering the State Aid for Public Library Construction program. As part of that work, I end up consulting with libraries across our system on their facility planning, from very basic things to very complex and multi-million-dollar expansion projects. At this point in my career, I've worked on over 50 projects and administered just over $5 million worth of grant funds. So I've seen a bunch of things, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today are some things that I know that if you had in place would make your life a lot easier and put you in a much better place for applying, particularly for the State Aid for Public Library Construction grant, but I would imagine other grants as well. So what's offered today is offered as an introduction. They are suggestions and best practices, as well as some tools and tips for where you can get more information. So just so we're all on the same page, if you're a public library in New York State, you fall under the minimum standards for New York State, and there is an item under the regulatory language related to public libraries that you must maintain a facility to meet community needs, which is the extent of the regulatory language in terms of what that looks like. They note having adequate space, lighting, shelving, seating, and restrooms, but we really try to describe this as you know it when you see it if your community needs are being met through your facility. While the Division of Library Development, who oversees the minimum standards, does offer a minimal amount of advice, you can find that on their website and their helpful information for meeting minimum standards section of their site. They talk about things like, basing your facility plan on your long-range plan, which should be based on community needs. They have a general statement about accessibility and a very general statement about complying with legal mandates, whether they be local, state, or federal. They don't give you much more assistance than that at the regulatory level. So what we're trying to do through this webinar is help you have maybe a better fighting chance of fulfilling the real role here, which is to be a good steward of the public facility that you're in charge of, whether you be the library director or the library trustees. The idea of being a good steward is paramount when we're thinking about how we retain the public trust and the public's goodwill and inspire them to invest in our organizations, whether it be our annual operating aid to keep everything going smoothly, or when we have to make a very big ask and ask our public to invest in a much larger capital project. Either way, you build trust over time, and a big part of that is stewardship, which is really about being careful and responsible managing something that's entrusted to your care. And I think that's a very simple way to think about this, that it's not your library, it's the community's library. So if you're trusted with taking care of it, what does that look like? And what are some tools that can help you manage that asset, which is sometimes a complicated asset? Not many library directors are facility managers, yet we are expected to act as such in many cases, particularly in smaller libraries where we don't have custodial or janitorial staff. So that combination of effort between the library board, often in the form of a facility committee, as well as the day-to-day management aspect of that role of the director, those two things combined are really aided by having just a basic understanding of your facility and a basic plan in place so everyone understands the expectations for maintaining the building and also for how to organize your thinking and financial planning for the future. So when you think about planning for the future, I think planning sometimes feels very overwhelming. So today we really want to take the time to break it down into kind of more bite-sized chunks to make it manageable for your library. Top reasons to be doing this. Number one is that stewardship aspect to extend the useful life of the facility and its components. We're going to talk a bit about preventative maintenance and getting that on a schedule to make sure you get the most bang for your buck on things like your boiler and your air conditioning units, whatever those might look like. Another big reason for having a plan in place is to get clarity between the director and board about where we're going, what we're doing, and what the priorities for the future are. Because a lot of people will have a lot of ideas about what you could do with the building and what should be done with the building, but until it kind of gets put in writing and things get slotted in terms of what we're going to work on first, it's tough to make those things happen. So getting things in writing, everyone agrees on it, everyone understands where we're going next, Really helpful for the director on a day-to-day basis, really helpful for grant seeking as well. And so that issue of financial planning and grant seeking, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about too. Definitely a bit of outside of the actual written plan that you're going to end up with, but it's, I think, a helpful leg up to understand where common sources of money is for things like your maintenance and replacement costs, as well as bigger renovation and expansion plans. And having that plan in place makes all of that stuff go smoother. The other thing I'll point out is that the state aid for public library construction is administered at the system level. And so the MidHudson Library System Board has to set priorities for how they judge applications that come in. And because it's such a competitive grant program, they're definitely looking whose project is very well planned out and lines up with their plan. So that's actually one of the mandates for that construction grant program, is that you provide a board-approved, prioritized list of projects that you're working on, and the application should match up with one of those prioritized projects. So directors are familiar. We do an annual action memo that comes out. It'll be coming out on April 6th this year, which asks you to submit that plan to MidHudson to make sure we've got that even before your application comes in. And so that should all line up nicely if possible. So we want to give you, again, a leg up on what that might look like. So in the past, when I used to talk about this, a lot of times we would see directors kind of look like this, like, oh God, I don't even really want to know what's going on in my building, but I know I have to know. And oh my God, where do I even start? And so a couple of years ago, I created a very simple outline to help library directors just get a handle on their building, to understand, what the different components are, what they should be looking at, and to really give directors who, again, aren't building managers or construction managers a fighting chance to stay on top of things in their building that need preventative maintenance and that they should be thinking about long term. Because there's many things about your building that if you're not kind of keeping a watchful eye on, there can be what I would call catastrophic failures that are now not just a replacement cost for something. It might then result in damage to other aspects of your building. A big example might be a roof that no one kept track of how old it is or was not checking the condition of it. And then you have a collapse. And it just passed Williams Lumber in Rhinebeck. Their roof collapsed last week during that big snowstorm. And you can imagine the damage to their inventory and the rest of the building and the downtime for their business because of that. I'm not saying that's not because they weren't on top of their building. I'm just saying that to avoid big events like that, sometimes it's just about staying on top of it on a more routine basis instead of waiting 30, 40 years before you check out how things are going in the boiler room. So what we've developed is a sample outline that has 3 parts to it. This outline, it's available as a Microsoft Word version that kind of pulls together all the stuff we're talking about. If that's useful to you, I'll point out where you can get that. But what we're going to do today is go through parts 1, 2, and 3 of this. And I just wanted to point out that if you add part 1 to part 2, that can help you equal part 3. So we're going to take a look at useful life of maintenance and replacement schedules, assessments and projections in 4 specific categories that I think give you a well-rounded feel for your building. And then just take a look at what it might look like when you pull all that information together and start to prioritize what needs to get worked on first, because that becomes then your plan. That's very useful to send to MidHudson along with your construction application if this is your year to do that. So starting out with part 1, we've got the useful life maintenance and replacement schedule. And this is a lot of words to describe something that I think is actually pretty basic. What we're looking at is, taking a look at each of the major components of your building. Let's take your roof, for example. How old is your roof? What kind of maintenance schedule do you need for the roof? It might just be a visual inspection on an annual basis to watch for things until you know it's reaching the end of its useful life. Who's in charge of doing that annual visual inspection, and what the projected replacement schedule might be. How old is the roof, and about when could you expect for it to have to be replaced? Most roofs come with a 20 or 30-year lifespan, but when you inherit a building, as most directors do, it might not be obvious how old the roof is, and that could be an unknown of when you're going to have to replace that. So doing the legwork to find out how old some of those systems are, and I'll give you a list of which things I think you might want to be thinking about, that can really help you get a feel for when you're going to have cash to replace something and what that might look like to manage that project to get it done. Things in the notes field might be estimated cost for the actual ultimate replacement of that thing. It could be a vendor that helps you do your annual preventative maintenance. It could be, whatever you need it to be. Any known issues related to it, like maybe you have a skylight or a chimney that also needs some assistance and things to be looked at. So this is just an example to show you of what we're talking about. The area or item would be one of those major systems like your roof or your HVAC or your parking lot, how old that thing is. So again, we gave the example of the roof, say it was done in 2010. What are you doing to stay on top of the health and well-being of the roof? Maybe it's an annual visual inspection that the director is in charge of, or the director is hiring a professional to come in and do. And then what's your projected replacement schedule for that? Most aspects of buildings have end of useful life, meaning this is when it's going to need to be replaced before you start having major failures of that item, like we described the roof. So if you could estimate when that replacement schedule is, that gives you a sense of, okay, well, if I know it's going to cost $25,000 and I've got another 20 years to save up for that money for that project, putting a little bit away each year into your capital fund means you're going to be ready for that replacement when it's time and it comes due. Just like managing your own home that you may own. It's really thinking about, how am I going to pay for that in the future, and what are my opportunities today to mitigate that in the future. So that replacement schedule, the projected replacement schedule, it might not be spot on, but you want to have a pretty good estimation of when that thing is going to have to be replaced to the best of your knowledge or to the best of an expert's knowledge that you've hired to come in and estimate the end of useful life for that item. So that's kind of what we're describing here in part one. It's just an itemization of some of the aspects of your building. And let's take a look at what some of those aspects could be. We've mentioned the roof. We mentioned on the last page the furnace, but it could be other aspects of your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, also called your HVAC system. That can be made up of a number of components, whether you have a furnace or a boiler, whether you have central air or air conditioning units in the wall or in the windows. You need to kind of itemize how your building works and what the pieces of equipment are related to making it work and making it a comfortable environment both to work in and for patrons to come in and use your facility. Taking a look at your parking lots and sidewalks, any paved areas that you have on your property. If you have an oil tank or a propane tank, getting a feel for how old that is and when it would need to be replaced. We had a library a couple of years ago that needed to have their oil tank replaced, but they only had to have that done when they found out it was leaking, because no one even knew it was how old it was or actually where it was, which was an unfortunate discovery process for the library. So doing that assessment at a time when it's not a crisis is extremely helpful. Getting the best sense of how old something is, whether through its institutional memory, through the minutes of your board meeting, or I'm going to show you an example of a library who hired someone to come in and estimate the ages of these types of things and give that data to you all in one fell swoop, which, depending on the size of your building, might be something you want to consider. Taking a look at your septic system, or if you have a sewer connection, getting a sense for how that works. Again, it's always easier to figure these things out when it's not exploding or cracked and leaking. Getting ahead of this kind of stuff, I think, really makes everyone feel more confident. They know what to do, A, if something were to go wrong, and B, that they feel like they've got a good handle on if that's the kind of thing that needs routine maintenance or might need to be replaced in the future. A couple of other things to think about is your well, if you have a pump, or if you're connected to municipal water, what that looks like and how that works. A big thing for libraries is carpeting or whatever kind of flooring you have. And we're going to talk about that later when we assess the safety of your facility. Again, carpeting has a useful end of useful life that will need to be replaced. And old style of carpeting for libraries is carpeting in one big piece, which means it's very hard to replace just small components of it. Where you'll notice the more modern libraries who have had a more recent renovation, they use carpet tiles, which they can swap out. So it's not as big a ticket item to replace carpeting in a newer library compared to an older library if you have carpeting. Your fire suppression system, and if you have an elevator, making sure, I'm sure everyone who has an elevator already knows the importance of preventative maintenance and what the useful life of that is, because it's an extremely expensive item to replace. So that's just a general list of things you might want to consider. Your library building might have some other aspects to it that aren't on this list, but you'll figure that out as you start walking through your building and getting to know what those machines in your mechanical room do. So the issue I think here is that even though a library director and board aren't building experts or architects or engineers themselves, it is your responsibility to understand how your building works. So doing a walkthrough, maybe even as part of your board orientation or as a board exercise every few years to make sure everyone's familiar with the building and the general aspects of how it runs, I think very much helps inform conversations at the board table when you start talking about budgeting for maintenance or an upcoming replacement or the need to start doing these types of things. I think it helps when people also have the visual of what we're talking about in some of these areas. And for people who feel a bit intimidated by this, there might be someone on your board who has a background that is more helpful on this than you might feel yourself, or you may decide after kind of assessing your skill set in your organization that you need to hire an outside person to come and help you do this. And definitely libraries have done that in the past. This is an unrelated item, but I just thought it might be helpful to you. There's this great book, and I'm going to recommend it to you twice during this presentation, The Librarian's Facility Management Handbook by Carmine and Marcia Trotta. They have so many helpful items in this book, and this was one that I thought really spoke to this aspect of your plan. This idea of creating kind of a schedule every year that it just becomes, this is what we do when in our organization. So once you've kind of organized the items in the facility plan, these are just the basic things, how old they are, and the types of maintenance that have to happen on a routine basis to make sure we extend its useful life, then slotting that into a calendar. So each year it's not a surprise that, oh, it's time to do this again. It just becomes the way we do things. And I think that's a really critical thing to have in hand, particularly when you think about succession planning. If you have a director retiring or leaving for another job and a new director coming in, or a high level of turnover on your board, this is the kind of document that when the new people come in, they'll be extremely grateful for, so they don't have to start from scratch. So if you don't have something like this now and you realize that you're going to be building it over the course of the next year, why don't you go ahead and put it in writing? I think you'll be glad you did next year and the year after that, as will new people coming into your organization. So I wanted to show you an example here. This is the Desmond Fish Library in Garrison. They did actually a very formal plan. About 2 years ago, they hired an architectural firm to come in and assess their building and do some of these life cycle replacement costs assessments for them. So they had everything done in one fell swoop. They had someone come in, assess the building, identify the components, estimate the age of them and when they were going to age out, and also provide some estimated costs around those things that are going to be coming to the end of their useful life and when. And the director reported this report has been invaluable to their board in many ways, getting on top of things that were about to be done and they didn't realize that, as well as things that are coming down the pike that they're going to have to do some serious financial planning for because their library is funded in a very creative way, which means the money might not be readily available in a capital fund to do some of this stuff. So she said it's helped the board feel more confident and comfortable. They understand the needs of the building and that they know what's coming next so they can plan for that. So the second part of the plan, and I just wanted to mention here, we're going to be taking questions at the end. So jot down your questions or pop them in the chat box and we'll get to everyone's questions towards the end of the presentation. The second part of the basic facility plan is assessments and projections. So in part one, we were really doing kind of an existing conditions report of major systems in your building, things that you have to stay on top of, perhaps on an annual basis, as well as cost out. There's other areas that you have to kind of evaluate your building against, and these can identify some top priority items that your board and your budget should focus on in the coming years. And I think there's 4 categories that cover the majority of stuff that come up for libraries: safety and code compliance, accessibility, energy conservation, and future space needs. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of the 4 of these categories we've identified. When it comes to safety and code compliance, taking code compliance first, that's pretty straightforward. You know, when the fire inspector comes in and he points out something that's not quote unquote to code, that's something you obviously make note of and you address before he comes back, whatever timeline he's given you, he or she's given you to address that item. So code compliance when it comes to local building code, fire inspection, that's pretty straightforward. Your local officials are going to be helping you identify those issues when they're in your building, and it's something you should respond to in a very timely manner, particularly because you've got local overseers who are going to be checking in on you and reporting both formally and informally on your progress on those issues. But there's other issues you should be taking a look at and evaluating, I think, on your own, just as a kind of public safety eye towards the way people use your building and live in your building. Just real basic things that you might, become, desensitized to the longer you're in the building. But taking a look at trip hazards, you want to minimize the possibility of someone tripping and, make note of the efforts that you take to minimize those trip hazards. Longtime directors know that, that day that someone trips and falls in your library and you're writing that incident report is the time that you're wishing you'd really dealt with something sooner. And if you have dealt with something, having that paperwork in place can really help you should someone who's tripped and fallen in your library end up suing you. You want to be able to prove a good faith effort to address an issue prior to an accident, if at all possible, but certainly after an accident. Other things you might want to think about are any handrails for stairs in your library, whether that be in public areas or staff areas, external to the building or inside your building. Lighting, are all areas of your building lit appropriately? Whether that be outside between someone walking from your front door to a parking area or the street, or inside your library, are there adequate lighting for areas that are commonly used by patrons and staff to help them stay safe, as well as to create adequate lighting for the activity that's meant in the area that they're in. So is there actually, task lighting available? Is there safety lighting available? Just another area that, could be harmful to someone if they kind of wander into an area of your building that's not well lit and they bump into something or trip over something. It's just that kind of, again, something you might get used to the longer you're in your building, but again, is a safety issue that should be on the front burner. Another issue that comes up a lot for libraries is storage. We have a lot of libraries in more historic buildings and certainly not designed to be libraries, public libraries, and in many cases not designed to be modern public libraries, meaning libraries that actually are producing programs on a regular basis and need supplies to process books and need storage for technology areas. So we often find libraries doing the best they can with limited space. And sometimes that means storing things in areas that aren't necessarily ideal. And I mean perhaps a staircase or a landing of a staircase or your mechanical room or surrounding a piece of equipment that needs a little more airflow around it. So just being sensitive to, while libraries are trying to do their best, if it's not ideal, making note of it and getting it on a list in this plan would be ideal to say this is an area we really need more storage for this type of thing. We need to clear out the mechanical room. And really that's, there's two major things all brand new buildings are trying to achieve, not only programming space and technology space, but definitely storage space, something that is often underestimated when libraries are doing renovation and expansion projects. So itemizing that, getting that on your assessment list can ensure that when you're talking, at a later stage of facility planning to an architect or a building consultant, that doesn't get left off the list. You will regret it, and as I'm sure your peers who have gotten into new buildings will tell you. The second area under assessment and projections is the issue of accessibility. And that's the accessibility of people coming into your building that might be using a wheelchair or crutches or be differently abled than a able-bodied person. And a very common thing I hear from libraries across the state is that, we don't have to worry about full accessibility in our buildings because libraries are grandfathered in under the Americans with Disabilities Act. ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, is the federal legislation that works to ensure all public facilities are accessible to people of all abilities. And there's no such thing as being grandfathered in. And I am sorry to break that to many of you who have said this to me, but that is the truth. And so if your library is not fully accessible, and we're going to go over the different areas of your building that should be accessible to everyone, also please note from a policy standpoint that if your building currently isn't fully handicap accessible, accessible, that you do need to address that both in your facility plan and annually at a board meeting. This should be acknowledged, noted in the minutes that the board is aware and is working towards a solution. While it might not be financially feasible this year, they're working towards finding solutions. And we're working to bring in a presenter to talk about accessibility in a much more extensive way than I'm going to today. But just, make a note there. If your building isn't fully accessible, this is something to maybe put a little more thought into in writing that you might have in the past. So there's a fabulous website called adachecklist.org. If you want to go right to the checklist, you can go to adachecklist.org/checklist.html. And at this website, they have really useful tools that are using the 2014 version of the Americans with Disabilities Act and helping you walk through your facility and assess it yourself. So the types of areas they're going to be looking at are these 4 areas. The approach and entrance to your facility, from where someone might be parking or getting off a bus and making their way to the entrance of your library and getting through the entrance into the building. It takes a look then once someone is inside your building, do you have the minimum required width between the stacks of books and between the stacks and your technology area? And can you get into the programming space and to the technology? So helping you kind of assess both your layout of your area of your library and the positioning of furniture and the stacks, and helping you get a sense of what those measurements should be if you start moving things around, which is something sometimes libraries dive into without considering that when they do some of their measurements for that. Taking a look at your restrooms, which they call toilet rooms, to make sure you have a facility that is accessible to especially someone in a wheelchair who can get through the door, turn that wheelchair around. There's very clear measurements of what should be in place. And that's often where libraries and historic buildings definitely have to do some work, and it's challenging work because they often, it would be an extremely expensive project to do it. But again, it's something the library should demonstrate effort towards on a regular basis until you're able to achieve that. The 4th area is kind of a catch-all of additional access issues, things like your drinking fountains, fire alarms, and the old school days when we had public telephones in libraries. Obviously, you probably still have a telephone that someone should have access to and not have to climb over your book sale donations to get to. So it just kind of gives you an opportunity to holistically think about your building, maybe through the eyes of someone who's different from you. Again, I think the longer you're in a building, the more you just kind of think about how you use it, but it's a good exercise to think about how someone in a wheelchair might have to navigate your facility and what life might be like for them trying to come in and use a public library. So just to give you a look at what those checklists look like, this is from that website we just showed you. So for the first one, it helps you kind of itemize, what building you're doing, and then it walks you through each of the design areas of your facility that you need to give some thought to. And then that can become the checklist of stuff that needs to get worked on that ends up in your facility plan. So when you're considering, what are the projects we need to work on in our building, I would imagine anything related to full accessibility of your building is going to be pretty close to the top. The second area, or third area rather, that to think about during the assessment and projections phase of your plan is that of energy conservation. And this has been a very hot topic over the past 10 years in public libraries, again, because so many library buildings were built either A, not for library purposes and have not particularly aged well, or were actually built during a time when construction practices weren't with an eye towards energy conservation. And this is an operational cost decision that most boards are pretty pleased to make when they can invest some money up front to make a building more energy efficient and stabilize operating costs. That's a great talking point with your public and really speaks to good stewardship of your building. So it can reduce your operating costs by either costing less to heat the building or costing less to cool the building. It can also help with how people feel in your space. For those of you that are in buildings that are a little bit drafty or very hard to keep warm or keep cool, you know what I'm talking about. Those people, staff who always have sweaters on, or patrons who never take their coats off when they come in the building. And often it's not because they're strange, it's because your building isn't quite comfortable for them. It can also address air quality issues in terms of getting fresh air into the building on a regular basis. And that's, we use the acronym HVAC, heating, ventilation and air conditioning. The ventilation system in your library may or may not be ideal for whatever hodgepodge of an HVAC system you have to heat and cool your building. So getting a sense of that or redoing that aspect of your building can often improve air quality in the building as well. And I think on this particular topic, energy conservation is, again, a great talking point in your community to demonstrate that you're thinking about the long haul and the long-term operational costs of the building. I'm going to show you an example of a library that really took that to the nth degree to demonstrate that they took a long-term approach to addressing energy conservation. And thanks to it, it's really kept their operating costs in this area down and made for a healthier building. So there's two, I would say, primary construction or facility maintenance areas that are your primary opportunities for energy conservation. You'll hear the phrase building envelope, and that's really referring to just the outside areas of your building, right? Your roof, windows, doors, walls, and foundation. Making sure those are well insulated, that there's not many cracks, that you've got double paned windows, that your roof has what's called a high R value. And that's something you'll get familiar with when you start shopping for a new roof in your building. But that building envelope you should think of almost as a system. It all works together to help control the energy consumption of your building, either through air infiltrating into your building or what they call air exfiltrating out into the air in nature. So you have to make sure you're not heating or cooling too much air that's escaping outside. So that's why you'll see libraries that are being built normally have a two-door system coming in, that you've got a vacuum or a vestibule when you've come in from the outdoors. So you can control how much air comes out from the main part of your building into the great outdoors. Your HVAC equipment is another opportunity. When you're replacing something like a water heater or a furnace or a boiler, making sure you're shopping for Energy Star rated products and looking for very high ratings under Energy Star, because those are the ones that are going to be the most energy conserving for you. And surprisingly, one of the other big areas of opportunity isn't necessarily a construction project or a renovation project or a replacement project, but it's how you teach your staff to use your building. So making sure everyone is trained in how the HVAC system works, how the thermostat works. We had a really funny story one year of a library staff who was really working well together to figure out how to trick the thermostat because they were cold and they wanted the heat to kick on. They were using a bag of frozen peas that they were resting on the thermostat to make the thermostat think it was colder in the room, so it would crank up the heat to keep them warmer, which of course ultimately resulted in the peas thawing and enough water getting into the thermostat unit that it burnt out and killed it. No unanticipated cost there. But when people understand how the building works, it will run better. And that's a lesson I learned with dealing with a lot of historic buildings in our region. You'd be surprised how smart older buildings are and how renovations that might have happened 3 or 4 decades ago undid very smart systems that were built into those older buildings. So really getting to know how your building works is important. And that occupant behavior might be something to think about. Is your staff trained in just basic things about the building? You know, why you don't leave this window open when the AC is on. You know, common sense stuff, but you can't assume everyone in your building understands how that works. So I mentioned Energy Star before, and that's an important thing to keep in mind if you want to apply for the State Aid for Public Library Construction Grant, because in the area of energy conservation, normally libraries are applying for replacement cost items when the boiler has reached the end of its useful life or your roof has reached the end of its useful life. It's only eligible under the grant program if it's framed in an energy conservation selling point. So there's a document that you can find at midhudson.org/NYS construction grant /, which I'll give you again later, which is called the Useful Life Energy Conservation Standards, which notes that the MidHudson Library System has adopted Energy Star as the standard for demonstrating to our board that the product you've picked is in fact an energy conservation choice that you've made. So that's, I think, just good practice, and it's pretty standard practice actually across many industries of how to ensure the choices you're making for your building for the long haul do demonstrate a commitment to energy conservation. For those of you that want to take energy conservation a couple steps further, you might want to check out the Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which helps you make even better decisions than just purchasing equipment. So very interesting stuff going on through the Energy Star program, which is funded by the Environmental Protection Act, the EPA. That administration has been in the news quite a bit lately, and I'll just leave that comment there. The other thing you might want to consider having done is a professional energy audit. There's different types of energy audits out there, so I just wanted to make sure you were familiar with the differences between them. These levels are kind of like the industry standard when you're calling up an engineering firm and asking them to do energy audit of your building. What they'll do in level 1 is kind of briefly visit your building, do a walk around, and help you identify some just very basic low-hanging fruit kind of things you could do that would result in some energy conservation. And they might identify some capital improvements, window replacements or roof replacements that you might want to think about in the long haul. Level 2 is probably more useful to you, where they spend a little more time in your building, do a more detailed survey of the building, really analyze how energy gets used in your building, and take a look at where your opportunities are to save or reduce energy in your building. And then they'll also identify those energy conservation measures that you'll want to think about on a longer timeline, perhaps, than some of that low-hanging fruit that gets identified in level 1. So this might be a little deeper than you want to go, but it's something to keep in mind, because I think if you're going to be looking for grants for energy conservation, if you're able to say the decisions you're making are based on an expert's opinion, that's what really helps sell the project, particularly for the State Aid for Public Library Construction grant. So just a heads up that there is a program through the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority that will help pay for 50% of an energy audit at your library. So if that's something that's on your to-do list, make note of that, because that could be an opportunity to get some of the money back that you might expend on that program. You might recall that they used to have a free program through their commercial audit program, and that got closed out at the end of 2016. So there's no more free energy audits through NYSERDA. This is the best they've got right now, the Flex Tech program. But I know the regional engineer who worked with NYSERDA during the free audit era is working to see if they can cut a deal to get some better deals for libraries. If we get an update on that, we'll let you know. But for now, this is your best bet. Up to 50% of the energy audit costs you could get reimbursed through NYSERDA's Flex Tech program. So the fourth category in the second part of your basic plan is to assess your space needs. Now that you've kind of done your existing conditions report of your systems and how everything's operating, your accessibility issues, your energy conservation issues, the next thing you might want to consider is your current space needs. You're going to be dealing with, I would think, shifts in service over the next few years, where we are not so slavishly devoted to being stacks and stacks of stuff. We've got libraries that are desperately trying to figure out how to fit more people spaces in their buildings. And that's always your first role, right? Is to figure out what can you do with what you've got today. Can you reorganize something? Could you reduce the size of this service point to make more room for a new service point? Just seeing what you can do with what you've currently got. And then once you've identified that there's other stuff that has to happen that you just can't make happen in your current space, no matter what you do, then you start identifying that you've got an inadequate amount of space, and you start itemizing what it is you need space for, which is kind of when you're starting to make the case that it's time to do a major renovation or expansion project to increase the square footage of your library. And that then takes you down a new path, right? Once you've identified that and you've done a good job of assessing your needs, that your community is asking for this kind of stuff and we're not able to do it with our current facility. Here are the things we want to be able to accomplish that we currently can't. That's the basis for when you're talking and putting an RFP out for a building consultant and architect to help you figure out a master facility plan, which is going to entail detailed plans for how to expand your building and what that's going to look like and what the implications are are, and ultimately how much something like that is going to cost you. So when we talk about the basic facility plan, that wouldn't include that level of detail. It would just be kind of the first pass at identifying that you have a need, that there's no longer adequate space, and these are the kinds of things we need to do that we can't, and that then triggers a master facility planning phase, which would be a whole nother workshop, not this one today. So here's an example from the town of Esopus of this kind of phase of their plan. They did construction assessments and plans, and they walked through accessibility. They walked through as if they had a wheelchair. What would it be like in our building? Their building is relatively new, built in 2007. They've assessed that they're in pretty good shape when it comes to accessibility in that space. They've also assessed from energy consumption because they prioritized that during their construction. They designed it for energy efficiency. It's got geothermal. They've got solar arrays. They're offsetting electrical costs to the maximum amount they can currently. So they didn't really find much need in that area either. Again, fairly new, no major repairs were anticipated, but they did identify a couple of near-term renovation and reconstruction projects that probably need to happen. These are things that could be done without pushing the walls of the building out. They can be done within the existing structure. And so that's what they've prioritized for now. They found no need for large expansion at this time, and that's also noted in their report. So just to I wanted to give you an idea of the level of detail we're talking about here. We're just kind of capturing information. We're just kind of getting it in writing, getting it in a plan so that everyone can take a look at it in your organization, agree on what needs to get done, and prioritize that. And then you can get into the nitty-gritty of how you're going to get that done, who you're going to ask to help you do it. But first, you've got to capture it. And I think that's the basis of a basic facility plan, is that you're just doing kind of a first wash, capturing some basic things and getting it in writing. So that third area then is just kind of creating that prioritized list of what needs to get done when. So you're taking a look at what do you have to do to stabilize the building? Is there anything screaming out that needs to get done? Like that handrail on the basement stairs that's just like been hanging by a thread for a long time, or your sidewalk that's completely crumbled and frost heaved and is a huge trip hazard. What do you have to do to stabilize the building, getting it in everyday operating mode and condition? And then what are those things you can do to optimize the facility? It might be your accessibility issues or your energy conservation issues that would optimize your current operations. And then taking a look at what's going to help you prepare for the future. And the truth is, you might be able to come up with a project that hits all three of these things. So that's why we don't just have you prioritize things in part one and part two, because you might be able to do one project that encompasses a number of things that does all three: stabilizes, optimizes, and helps you prepare for the future. We have a library that has a long-term building plan, but their financial situation means they can't do it all at once. So they picked a phase of that building project, that building plan, and so they're redoing the entrance to the building, which helps them with accessibility issues. It helps them with safety issues because it fixes some sidewalk things, and it also just really kind of minimally, but it does increase the square footage of a storage area that happens to be underneath the ramp into the library. So they've actually managed to do all three of those things in one project package that they then applied for through the State Aid for Public Library Construction Grant Program. So again, I think just doing those assessments in part one and part two help you imagine what a project might look like that encompasses a number of areas that you're trying to achieve. And then you always want to be able to tie the work that you're doing to your community-based long-range plan. If you address this issue through a project, whether it be a grant-funded project or through your own capital fund, how does that help improve services for the community? Does it increase access? Does it create staff efficiencies? Does it reduce operating costs? You want to be able to speak with some authority of why this is a good thing for everyone to invest some money in that at this time. So here's an example from the Catskill Public Library. Again, very basic. They prioritized the things they found by doing the walkthroughs that we've talked about. And then they created a plan for themselves for the next few years. I think they wrote this plan in 2014. And you can see they had an energy audit done that helped them make some decisions. They'd done an assessment of the age of their roof and the age of their plumbing system because they're in a Carnegie building, and I'm pretty sure the plumbing and boiler was original to the building. building. So they really, while the director was pretty new, she felt like she had a good handle on the age of her building, the age of major systems, and how to make sure they were replacing things at a pace that was going to help them create a great environment for the library, but also avoid the dreaded catastrophic failure. And what I mean by catastrophic failure, I gave you the roof example earlier, but another one, another example that I like to use is a library 3 years ago. If you remember, 3 years ago, the winter was pretty harsh, and a library who called me in an absolute panic because their boiler had just died, not working anymore. The plumber came and took a look at it, assessed that it was not salvageable. They were going to need a new one, and it was going to cost quite a few thousands of dollars given the size of the building. And the director called me in absolute panic. Rebecca, how are we ever going to pay for this? We never saw this coming. So I asked her, well, how old was the boiler? Thinking, wow, I didn't realize they had that replaced recently. And she said, oh, it's original to the building. And I'm thinking to myself, that building was built in the 1800s. That is something that you saw coming and you could have been saving a little bit for every year so that when it went, it wasn't, oh my God, how are we going to pay for this? It was no problem. We've got some money saved. Maybe you didn't have all of it saved, but you were pretty close because you knew that was coming. And that's the whole idea of preventative maintenance and estimating those ends of useful life. So again, this third part of your plan could be, oh, it looks like in 2 years we're going to have to pave the parking lot. It might be, oh, we finally have enough money to do the handicap accessible bathrooms. But again, it's just getting all that stuff in one place so you can see it all and plan for it and figure out where the money is going to come from. And that is something that I want to talk about, is where the money is going to come from during our time here together. But I did want to recommend 2 books before we move on to talking about how to pay for stuff. These are just very basic books in the library profession. I honestly think almost every director should probably own these, particularly if you don't have a building operational background. But the book on the left there, Managing for Results, the Managing Facilities for Results, is part of the Public Library Association's Results series. And that whole series of books helps you optimize aspects of being a library based on community needs. So that's a great book when you're thinking about how to reorganize the library's space based on the new things or the current things you need to do in the space, whether it be housing collections, access to technology, programming space, small meeting space, different staff space for what needs to get done in a modern library. That's a great book for just some worksheets to help you work through some kind of big things that you might be doing in that space. And then the very practical Librarian's Facility Management Handbook. That's the book where I pulled out that example of the annual checklist of things that need to get done and the schedule on which you do them. There's probably another dozen checklists that I find extremely helpful in that book. Also advice for how to write an RFP, request for proposal, once you do need to find a vendor for a service or for some work you need to have done on your library. Just very practical, usable items that I think almost any director would find useful. So again, I can't resist getting through this without recommending those books. So I wanted to make sure those got on your list if you don't already have them. So let's talk a little bit about money and where the money comes from to do all this stuff, because running a library ain't cheap. And a lot of the things we're talking about have a pretty big price tag on them. So to think you're going to just, create that money out of thin air, just any old year out of your regular budget, it's kind of hard to comprehend that. So just to get a sense of just the 2 buckets of money I want to talk about, let's split the things you have to do into 2 categories. The first being just routine maintenance and the replacement costs of things. Maintenance issues should be coming out of the library's operations budget. So you probably have a line in your budget related to your facility, and that might cover snow plowing and your plumber when you need to call them, or any other items that you have. When someone comes in to clean the furnace, all that maintenance stuff should be built into your annual operating budget. Those are known costs. Those are operating costs that you need to keep the building going and running. And then you have the replacement costs for, when you have to buy the new boiler or you have to pave the parking lot. And those normally, some of them, sometimes depending on how much of a price tag they have on them, might come out of your budget, or you should be having created, if you haven't already, a capital fund where money is getting kind of saved up in. It's kind of a savings account for capital needs. And that's one of the 3 common reserve funds that libraries have. Libraries have fund balances, they have unrestricted reserve funds and capital funds. And this capital fund, that's what your eye should be on in terms of how much do you need in there. you can inform the answer to that question by doing the assessment of what are those upcoming replacement costs and the prioritized plans that you have. There's no limit on how much you can have in the capital fund as long as it's justifiable. And how you would justify the amount is being able to point to your facility plan and say, well, look, we've got 3 major items that need to be replaced in the next 5 years, and we're saving up for that. That's good stewardship. That's something any taxpayer can understand why you're doing. They'd rather see you put a little bit away each year rather than, again, have the library closed because you don't have the money to replace something, or you're scrambling, or you need to come to them with a special initiative for $25,000 because you forgot you're going to have to replace the roof. So I just think it shows good financial management and good stewardship of both the facility and the budget. Of course, you can always do grant writing if you need to. We'll take a look at some grant sources for capital projects. And your absolute last resort would be fundraising, because this is the kind of stuff that's predictable, that would fall under the category of operating costs and just mission critical things to keep the library going. So I think if you find yourself having to fundraise kind of at the last minute to do this kind of stuff, that's a tough story to tell, because it definitely kind of hints to the fact that someone wasn't on top of the needs of the facility. And if you're a new director, that might very well be the case, and you've inherited that situation, and I'm sure you can charm your way out of it. But I think as a new director, you'd want to get ahead of that so that doesn't happen in the future. The other side of things are your renovation and expansion costs. Again, depending on the price tag, you might have been able to save up some money in your capital fund to get that done. We have libraries that have been saving for absolute decades towards hopes they have for the future of their building. The Valatia Library up in Columbia County, they were able to squirrel away enough money to buy a new building. That's a small library, so it's a kind of a small building, so that's an achievable thing. It's not going to work out for a library that has, a larger population they're serving, that needs to have a larger facility that's available, that might be a multi-million-dollar project. It's unlikely you're going to be able to save up that kind of money in a capital fund. So depending on what type of library you are, if you're a public library, meaning a municipal, special, or school district public library, you could bond for funding. You could go to the taxpayers and include them in the conversation of what we need to do as a community to have a functioning library. And then once you feel you've gotten buy-in from the community, come to them and say, okay, this is the price tag on what we need to do as a community to get this done. What do you think? And give them the right to vote yes or no, to tax themselves to make that happen. If you're an association library, you don't have that opportunity to do that, and you're going to be doing a traditional capital campaign, which falls into the realm of fundraising. Even public libraries who have the right to bond are going to end up doing fundraising and grant writing as well, because you definitely want to be able to tell the story that you didn't solely rely on the taxpayer to get the work done, that you try to diversify where the money came from as much as you could. But again, depending on the size of your project, bond is going to be probably almost mandatory the larger the project is, meaning, over $1.5 million is very unlikely that you're going to get that in a capital campaign in this region. So many of you know that's the type of thing that if your library is working on and you need help on, just give me a call. I'll come out and help your board figure out how to move forward on that issue. On the grant side of things, because over the years I've discovered that many people on your board and many people in your community will think there must be grants out there that can just pay for all of this. And again, it always depends on the price tag of the project. If you're talking about something that's under $10,000, absolutely, there's grants out there to help you do that. If your project is, $2.5 million, well, you might get a few grants that help knock the price tag down, but not enough to cover the whole project. So let's just review where some common grant sources are that libraries in our region and throughout the state have identified and routinely have access to. There's the State Aid for Public Library Construction Program. Here in our region, we get over $500,000 to grant out to libraries. If the Albany negotiations go well leading up to a new state budget on April 1st, we might see some more money, which looks to be the case right now. I'm making no promises, but it looks like we'll see a little more money coming our way this year through that grant program. There's also something called special legislative grants that you can get through your legislator. The past 2 years, New York State senators have had a pot of money to give out to libraries and other educational institutions. That money is not guaranteed every year. You kind of have to keep your ear to the ground. Directors know we just talked about this at the last DA meeting about how to position yourself for that money. If you need some tips on that, just let me know. There's other two sources of money that have kind of mysteriously, let's say, revealed themselves over the past 2 years. They happen to be administered through the Dormitory Authority, also known as DASNY. And what we've discovered is this is two of several grant programs that DASNY administers. However, these two that come to libraries more regularly than I realized until a few years ago, it's not a straightforward path to get them. It's actually mediated by your state legislators. So your state senator and your state assembly person can help you access those funds. And the timing and the path to that, I can't necessarily speak to. It's been slightly mysterious for each library that's been able to tap into it. But again, I'd encourage you to speak to your state senator and state assembly person about if they may be able to help you get money from those grant sources. I'll point out on the MidHudson Library website, system website, again, this is the URL I gave you earlier, midhudson.org/New York State Construction Grant. The grant window doesn't open up until January, and that's only if the grant money is in the budget as of April 1st, which we're pretty sure it's going to be, but we can't say for certain until the budget passes. If you think this is your year to go for that grant, there are some things you could be doing right now to get ready for that. So those are on the checklist that you see on this webpage, and I encourage you to go check that out. And I would particularly ask that you take the time to attend the webinar on April 4th, which is the introduction to the grant program. That will be recorded if you can't make it on April 4th. But that's really the overview of the entire grant program and the grant application process, which is, I would say, cumbersome. And please do speak with other libraries who've been through that. It's a long process and there's a lot of paperwork. But again, you've got some help from MidHudson. You've got this website, you'll have the webinar, and we also provide technical assistance between now and when the applications are due in August. So keep your eyes out for that, both in the reports from me to the Directors Association and in the MidHudson Weekly Bulletin. A couple of other grant sources we've seen crop up, and these have been inconsistent, but libraries have tapped into them. The Regional Economic Development Councils, there's multiple councils throughout the state. Our system is split into two of those councils. Columbia and Greene are in the Capital District Council. The rest of our counties are in the Mid-Hudson Council. Take a look at their priorities for funding. What the governor has done is created these councils, and they become the filter for most state money. So grants from the State Historic and Preservation Office or through the Housing Development Authority, they actually get washed through these regional councils, and the money comes to organizations whose applications speak to the priorities of that particular council. So I would recommend you get familiar with the council, their priorities, and the next, I think there's I'll send you the URL for that if it's not later on in the website and the webinar. There's also regional community foundations. So in our region, we have the Hudson Valley Community Foundation. They often have designated funds set up by donors who might have a particular interest in funding education programs or particular organizations in one town. I haven't seen any library funds, but you never know. It's always worth it to take a look. Banks and credit unions and family foundations that might have a particular devotion to your town or something that you do, or have a familial connection on their board to the town that you serve. Always worth some research to find out what kind of family foundations are in the region. A good example of a family foundation that covers most of our region is the Dake family, who owns Stewart's Shops. You might be familiar with their smaller grants through the Holiday Match Program, but they also recently gave a $100,000 grant to the Gloversville Library for their capital campaign. So it's always good to investigate where other libraries are getting money. Just one of the tips I have for you, if once you do your plan and you're like, wow, 5-10 years from now, we're going to be embarking on a pretty major project, making sure you watch how other libraries put together the money. It's really going to be a patchwork quilt to get it done. So it's interesting to watch how libraries do this. Make sure you keep your state legislators on kind of up to date on what you're working on, what's coming up. They always are looking for ways to help their community and often have access to pots of money, sometimes inconsistently. So they need to know year round what you need, not just around this time of year when we're negotiating the budget in New York State. Take a look at other organizations in your town that are working on capital campaigns. Who are some of their major donors? They might surprise you. They might be people you also have access to. And there's that website for the Regional Economic Development Councils. So you see regionalcouncils.newyork.gov. You pick your county falls into the region, you pick the region, then you can read their reports and get a sense of what they're looking to fund and how you go about working with them to access some grant funds. I mentioned this one hesitantly because only one library in the state has managed to crack the code of getting grant funding through this source. But this library got a very large grant thanks to their persistence on that front. And so I think it's worth it to learn more about it because that changes from year to year. And you never know when your library might be in the right spot at the right time and know the right people to make something great happen for a big project that could change the face of your community thanks to your library's project. So just a few notes where you can go for more information before we start taking questions. We've got some upcoming webinars that might be of interest to you. We've got one tomorrow called Certifiably Sustainable, which is talking about a green business certification program that libraries have access to, which could help you walk through some of those building health issues as well as energy conservation issues. We've got that Introduction to the State Aid for Public Library Construction Grant Program coming up on April 4th, which is done by me and will be recorded. You'll have open access to that. And on May 9th, we're doing an Introduction to Sustainable Facilities, something that our board is starting to incentivize and prioritize. And it's a long-term decision making to help you get a sense of what that entails, some easy things you can be doing, and some big things to keep in mind if you embark on a larger renovation or construction project. So I'm ready to take some questions. I see one already, which is a very basic one, which is, can you pick up these slides? The answer is yes. After the workshop is over, I'll email everyone with a link to the recording, to the slides, as well as to the evaluation form. So you'll have all three of those things shortly. So if anyone else has questions, I'm happy to take them. You can use the chat box to type them in. We also know that we're close to our end time and that if you have to go, no worries. You guys always know how to get in contact with me. You've got my contact information. It's rsmith@midhudson.org via email or extension 239 here at MidHudson. And hopefully most of you know that I'm always here to help you and I'm happy to help you. And this is a big thing, so I'm sure any help you can get would be appreciated. If you need to talk to somebody else who's done something similar, I'm always looking to connect you with someone who's had a similar experience, or you can learn from other libraries. Or again, if you need me to help come speak with your board about this, I'm happy to do that. So we're happy to take questions. And before we go, I just want to say thank you to everyone who took the time to be here today. I think it's a big topic, but if you just start somewhere, start small, maybe just take one of the parts of the idea here behind the plan and just start chipping away at it. If you don't start now, you'll never get there, right? That's the whole point of a plan. So I wish you guys the best of luck. And again, I'm happy to take questions in the chat box or individually if you'd like to email or give me a call.